The story of how the United States became the world's greatest agricultural superpower is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of human civilization. It is a story built not on luck, but on an almost perfect collision of geography, innovation, policy, and relentless human ambition. Long before the United States was even a nation, the land itself was making promises. Stretching across nearly 3.8 million square miles, the North American continent offered a diversity of climates, soils, and river systems unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. From the rich black soils of the Midwest, known today as the Corn Belt, to the sun-drenched valleys of California, to the vast wheat prairies of Kansas and the Dakotas, the land held within it a natural agricultural potential that few civilizations in history had ever been handed on such a generous scale. 17659. The Mississippi River and its tributaries alone created one of the most fertile river basins on the planet, carrying nutrient-rich sediment across millions of acres of interior farmland and providing the irrigation and transportation networks that would later allow American agriculture to feed not just a nation, but the world. The earliest European settlers understood this potential almost immediately. The colonial era saw the planting of tobacco in Virginia, cotton in the Carolinas, and grain crops across the northeastern settlements, and while these early efforts were modest by modern standards, they established a culture of land cultivation that would define American identity for centuries. But it was the great westward expansion of the 18th and 19th centuries that truly unlocked the continent's agricultural power. As the young republic pushed beyond the Appalachians, crossed the Mississippi, and eventually reached the Pacific, it encountered the Great Plains. A staggering 500 million acres of grassland sitting atop some of the deepest, most fertile topsoil ever recorded. Scientists today estimate that the natural prairie soils of the American Midwest contain organic matter that took thousands of years of grassland ecology to build, and when these soils were finally broken open by the steel plow in the mid-1800s, the agricultural explosion that followed was almost incomprehensible in scale and speed. The role of government policy in accelerating this agricultural revolution cannot be overstated. The Homestead Act of 1862 was perhaps the single most consequential piece of agricultural legislation in American history. Under its provisions, any citizen or intended citizen could claim 160 acres of public land, farm it for 5 years, and receive full ownership at essentially no cost. Over the following decades, more than 270 million acres, an area larger than France and Germany combined, were transferred from federal hands into private farms. This radical democratization of land ownership created a vast class of independent farmers whose productivity and ingenuity would power the nation's agricultural engine for generations. At nearly the same moment, the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 established a network of public universities dedicated to agricultural science, engineering, and education. These institutions, which eventually grew into the great state universities of the Midwest and South, became the research backbone of American farming, producing the scientific advances in soil chemistry, crop genetics, and animal husbandry that would transform agriculture from a practice of tradition into a discipline of precision. Technology played perhaps the most dramatic role in elevating American agriculture to global supremacy. The invention of the mechanical reaper by Cyrus McCormick in 1831 fundamentally changed the economics of grain farming. Where a man with a scythe could harvest perhaps 2 acres of wheat per day, McCormick's horse-drawn reaper could cut 12 or more, multiplying the productive capacity of every farm family almost overnight. This was followed by the steel plow, the threshing machine, and eventually the gasoline-powered tractor in the early 20th century, each innovation compounding upon the last in a cascade of productivity gains that left the rest of the world struggling to keep pace. By the time the combine harvester, a machine capable of reaping, threshing, and cleaning grain in a single pass, became widespread across the Great Plains in the 1930s and 1940s, a single American farmer could tend and harvest hundreds of acres that would have required an entire village of laborers just a century before. The railroad system provided the crucial infrastructure that connected this vast agricultural landscape to domestic and global markets. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad had linked the Pacific coast to the east, and by the 1880s a web of rail lines crisscrossed the Great Plains, running directly into small farming towns and grain elevator districts that served as collection points for the staggering harvests pouring off the prairie. A farmer in Nebraska could now ship his wheat to Chicago in days, where it would be processed, traded, and shipped onward to Europe within weeks. The Chicago Board of Trade, founded in 1848, became the nerve center of global grain markets, establishing standardized commodity prices that shaped agricultural economies around the world. America had not merely become a leading food producer, it had become the architect of the global food trading system itself. The 20th century brought a second agricultural revolution that was in many ways even more transformative than the first. The development of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, following the discovery of the Haber-Bosch process in Germany in the early 1900s and its mass adoption in America after World War II, removed what had been the most fundamental constraint on agricultural productivity: the limited natural availability of nitrogen in the soil. With cheap, abundant fertilizer now available in virtually unlimited quantities, American farmers could grow crops year after year on the same land without the soil exhaustion that had historically forced rotations and fallowing periods. Combine this with the Green Revolution of the 1950s and 60s, during which American scientists, most famously Norman Borlaug working partly with USDA support, developed high-yielding, disease-resistant varieties of wheat, corn, and rice, and the result was an agricultural system producing yields per acre that previous generations would have dismissed as impossible fantasy. American corn yields, which averaged roughly 25 bushels per acre in 1900, had risen to over 175 bushels per acre by the early 21st century, a sevenfold increase driven almost entirely by scientific and technological progress rather than any expansion of farmland. Today, the United States produces approximately 13% of the world's total agricultural exports, ranking as the single largest exporter of soybeans, corn, and many other commodities, while feeding a domestic population of 330 million people with extraordinary efficiency and at historically low cost relative to income, a feat built, layer by layer, on the foundations laid by that first generation of homesteaders who broke the prairie sod and dared to imagine a harvest without limit. If the first chapter of America's agricultural story was about conquering the land, the second chapter was about conquering the world's food markets, and doing so with a thoroughness and strategic reach that no nation in history had ever achieved before. By the early 20th century, the United States was already producing far more food than its own population could consume, and the surplus that poured out of its farms every harvest season was not merely an economic asset. It was a geopolitical instrument of extraordinary power. American wheat fed the soldiers of World War I. American food aid helped rebuild the shattered economies of Europe after World War II, and American grain exports became one of the central levers of Cold War diplomacy, used alternately as a reward for allied nations and a weapon of economic pressure against adversaries. The 1972 grain deal with the Soviet Union, in which the United States sold approximately 19 million metric tons of wheat and corn to a rival superpower struggling to feed its own people, was perhaps the most vivid illustration of how completely America's agricultural abundance had become a defining feature of global power. When the Soviet Union needed bread, it had no choice but to come to America. The infrastructure that supported this global agricultural empire was as impressive as the farms themselves. By the mid-20th century, the United States had constructed the most sophisticated agricultural supply chain in the world, a seamless network of grain elevators, river barges, interstate highways, deep water ports, and refrigerated shipping containers that could move a bushel of Kansas wheat from the field to a bakery in Cairo or Lagos within a matter of weeks. The port of New Orleans alone handled tens of millions of tons of grain annually, making it one of the busiest agricultural export terminals on Earth. The Illinois and Mississippi river systems served as the central arteries of this logistics empire, carrying billions of dollars worth of corn, soybeans, and wheat downstream every year from the heartland farms of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Nebraska to the Gulf ports where ocean freighters waited to carry American abundance to every corner of the world. This infrastructure advantage was not accidental. It was the product of decades of deliberate federal investment in waterways, highways, and port facilities, a recognition by American policymakers that the ability to move food efficiently was just as important as the ability to grow it. The rise of agribusiness in the second half of the 20th century added yet another dimension to America's agricultural power. Companies like Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, and Louis Dreyfus, together known in the trade world as the ABCD companies, grew into global commodity trading giants that controlled enormous shares of the world's grain trading, processing, and distribution networks. These firms were not merely American corporations doing business abroad, they were the organizational backbone of the entire global food trading system, setting prices, managing logistics, financing harvests, and connecting farmers in the American heartland to consumers in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. By controlling the trading infrastructure as well as the production capacity, the United States effectively held both ends of the global food supply chain simultaneously, a position of structural dominance that gave American agricultural interests a degree of market power that was, and largely remains, without parallel in the modern world. American agricultural policy played a central and often underappreciated role in sustaining this dominance across changing economic conditions. The Farm Bill, renewed by Congress roughly every 5 years since the 1930s, provided American farmers with a complex web of price supports, crop insurance subsidies, and export assistance programs that insulated them from the volatility of global commodity markets in ways that farmers in most other countries could only dream of. Critics, particularly in the developing world, argued, with considerable justification, that these subsidies allowed American farmers to sell their crops on world markets at prices below the true cost of production, effectively pricing out local farmers in Africa and Latin America who received no such government support. Whatever one makes of the ethics of this arrangement, its practical effect on American agricultural competitiveness was enormous. Subsidized American corn and soybeans flooded global markets at prices that competitors could rarely match, securing market share for American exporters in countries across the developing world and entrenching America's position as the default supplier of the world's most important commodity crops. The soybean revolution of the late 20th century deserves particular attention as one of the most dramatic single examples of American agricultural adaptability and market-building genius. Soybeans were virtually unknown as a commercial crop in the United States before the 1940s. Yet within 3 decades American farmers had transformed the crop into one of the most valuable and widely traded agricultural commodities on Earth. By the 1970s, the United States was producing over half the world's soybeans, and by the 1990s, American soybean exports, used overwhelmingly for animal feed and cooking oil in rapidly industrializing Asian economies, had become one of the largest single sources of American agricultural export revenue. This transformation was not accidental. It was the product of sustained investment in crop research at land-grant universities, aggressive market development programs funded by producer checkoffs and USDA trade promotion budgets, and the extraordinary responsiveness of American farmers to market price signals, their willingness to shift millions of acres from one crop to another within a single growing season in response to changing global demand. No other agricultural system in the world demonstrated this combination of scientific capacity, logistical infrastructure, and farmer adaptability on anything approaching the same scale. Today, the United States stands at the apex of a global food system that it did more than any other nation to design, build, and operate. It is the world's largest exporter of soybeans and corn, the second largest exporter of wheat, and a dominant force in cotton, dairy, beef, pork, poultry, and an enormous range of processed food products. American agricultural exports generate well over $150 billion annually, supporting nearly 1 million jobs directly in farming and many millions more in processing, transportation, and related industries. The farms themselves have grown larger, more capital-intensive, and more technologically sophisticated with every passing decade. Precision agriculture systems using GPS-guided equipment, satellite soil mapping, drone surveillance, and artificial intelligence-driven planting and harvesting decisions are now standard practice on competitive operations across the Corn Belt and the Great Plains. And yet at its heart, the story of American agricultural supremacy remains what it has always been, the story of a nation that was given extraordinary land, built extraordinary institutions to develop it, and then built extraordinary infrastructure to share its bounty with the world, on terms that it largely set itself. That combination of natural endowment, institutional investment, technological ambition, and market power is what made America the undisputed agricultural superpower of the modern age, and what, for now at least, keeps it there.